So, folks, as the cold winter weather moves in, I thought I'd share a few more strange and downright spooky wilderness stories that my listeners have sent to me. So here you go. Story 1. Hello, my name is Ken Tucker, and back in the 80s and 90s, I was a full-time logger that operated primarily in the Trinity County region. One summer, I was doing some work near the top of Buck Mountain at around 5,000 feet in elevation. I was dragging some dug-for logs down an embankment that I had fallen the previous workday, when all of a sudden, a thick blanket of fog began rolling down the hill like a river and eventually settled on top of me. I found myself completely lost in the middle of the thickest sea of fog I've ever experienced. By the way, I should mention that it was crystal clear right before this happened. But now, I could no longer see more than a couple feet in any direction. And in this fog came an eerie silence. I stood there, just watching and waiting for it to dissipate, but it hadn't. Not long after, something began running around me. It worked its way around the edges of the woodline and gradually became closer. That's when I began to get a true sense of what might be happening. That I was being stalked by something that had the skill to maneuver around under the cover of thick fog. I had a general idea of where I was in proximity to my truck, and so I began carefully feeling my way toward it. I ran into a few trees on my way, but made it to the safety of my cab. I had no choice but to remain seated in there, as visibility was too poor to drive anywhere, let alone see the road. But as I sat there, I remembered hearing the hurried rush of footsteps all around me in the truck, the snapping of twigs, and the shuffling of rock. It was loud enough to notice, even through a closed door and window. It was about then I began seeing dark shapes moving around in that fog. They were large and quick, darting back and forth. Without thinking, I fired up the engine and laid on the horn. It must have worked because whatever was there eventually went away, and with it, so did that damn fog. As quickly as it arrived, it was gone. I have never been so happy to leave the worksite as I was that day, and I will never return to that area after what I had experienced out there. Story 2. I was camping in Big Sur, California with my partner of over 15 years for the weekend. We pretty much had the entire campground to ourselves and chose a campsite about a half a mile from the ocean in a large open field surrounded by thick forest. We spent that evening around the campfire telling stories and drinking hot cocoa. Afterward, we put out the fire, climbed into our shared tent with Cookie, my 5-year-old black lab, and then we went to sleep. Around 1 a.m., something startled my dog. She's usually very calm and used to overnight camping trips in the woods, but this time she was yanking at the leash, desperately trying to get out of the tent. She pulled so hard her harness snapped, and she bolted out of the small tent opening and across the field and into the woods. Both my partner and I grabbed our lights and chased after her, and it wasn't long before we found her curled up in another clearing and had to pick her up and carry her back to the camp. This really got to us, so we decided to hide inside the tent for the rest of the night. Meanwhile, Cookie refused to lay down. Her ears were up, and her gaze remained locked on that tent wall. That's when we heard the cackling, a high-pitched laughter right outside the tent. As you might imagine, we were terrified beyond speech. And then we heard a scream following the laughter and a guttural roar. We thought at first it could have been wolves or a bear killing its prey, but it sounded far too human. We just sat there until the freakish laughter ended. A couple hours later, we broke down camp at the first opportunity and left. We never looked back following that experience. It was just plain bizarre. Story 3. My buddy Mitch and I went to Yosemite National Park last fall, and during our time there, I had an experience that left me shaken to my very core. It was early October 2019 when Mitch and I arrived at the park and decided to take a 4-mile trail from Yosemite Valley to Glacier Point. It was a moderate hiking trail that only lasts about 4.5 miles, but offers a spectacular view of pretty much all of Yosemite's finest landmarks, like El Capitan, Yosemite Falls, Half Dome, the Merced River, and Tenaya Canyon. It was a perfect sunny day, and hiking conditions were just right for the trek. But while we were up there, something really strange happened to us, and I believe things would have been much worse had we not listened to our gut instinct when we did. It was around 2 p.m. and we reached a section of the trail that gave us our first real view of Yosemite Falls, kind of near the top, with about a half a mile to go before we had to turn around and head back. We decided to stop at this point, take a breather, and admire the view before continuing further up the trail. After a moment, though, Mitch said he needed to relieve himself and backtrack down the trail to a grove of trees for a little privacy while he did his business. As he disappeared from view, I laid my blue flannel on the ground and sat down on it, facing the trail ahead. And then I saw Mitch emerge from some bushes about 20 yards in front of me. He just stopped and stared at me before speaking up. And in a calm voice, he said he needed to show me something really cool, and gestured me to follow him. But I couldn't move. I was frozen in place and extremely confused. I was just trying to figure out how he managed to get ahead of me, when I specifically watched him venture down the trail. There was no way he could have snuck past me, because one side of the trail is extremely steep and dangerous, and the other side drops off hundreds of feet below. But before I could even ask how he managed to do so, he called out to me again. This time he was a bit more assertive. Still unable to move, I then heard a voice from behind me. It was Mitch asking who I was talking to. I remember feeling white as a ghost, and we both knew something wasn't right. When I turned back to look at the man ahead of me, he was gone. It wasn't Mitch after all, but some kind of copycat or impersonator, and believe me, I had a good look at the guy. I know how strange that sounds to anyone listening to this, but that was our cue to end our little adventure and head back. Initially, I thought I was hallucinating due to some elderberries I had eaten on the trail moments before. But that idea went out the window when Mitch told me that he had seen the guy as well as he came up the trail. I wasn't crazy after all. Both Mitch and I saw someone or something that tried luring me away from the trail. We were done hiking after that. Now, I've heard about people mysteriously disappearing in the park. Could my experience have something to do with this? Thanks for listening to my story, and I'd like to know if anyone else out there had anything like this happen to them. Story 4. During my hunting trip last August, I lost one of my dogs, but not the way one might expect. Nope. My 10-year-old beagle lost his life while chasing what I thought was a deer in the heart of Cascade Country, kinda over near the Klamath Falls area. It was a typical hunting trip for my 16-year-old son Jacob and I, along with our 3 dogs, Sammy, Chippy, and Beans. Beans was the leader of the pack and usually took point during most chases. Well, on that idle Tuesday afternoon, the 5 of us drove out to one of our favorite spots about 12 miles east of Lake of the Woods Resort in Oregon. Once our boots hit the ground, it wasn't long before we spotted our first buck. Unfortunately, this one disappeared before we even had the chance to pursue it. 30 minutes later, we spotted another one from the top of a ridgeline, but couldn't get close enough for a good shot. We continued on for another couple hours or so, and didn't have much luck after that. And at this point, the sun was beginning to settle, and nightfall was only about an hour away. But just as we were ready to give up and head back to the truck, I saw the biggest buck I'd ever seen. It was standing on top of a mound of boulders, looking down at us from about 100 feet away. We were actually kind of startled given its sheer size and the way it just stood there, looking at us. The thing is, it didn't appear to show any fear, a clear target, and it just doesn't get any better than that. Jacob and I must have fired several rounds at it, but it didn't even budge. It continued to stand there, completely unfazed. The strangest thing was, I knew I'd hit my target at least twice, and it was as if the deer had absorbed every one of those rounds. My son and I looked at each other without muttering a single word. It was then that Bean broke from his position and beelined it toward that buck. Despite my commands to stop, he went on anyway and disobeyed me, thrashing his way up through the heavy brush, and eventually reaching the top of that very same boulder where the buck was. By that point, the deer had already retreated into the thick woods that awaited it down on the other side. As Bean gave chase, his hunting cries began to fade, and he too disappeared into those woods. Naturally, we rushed in after him with Sammy and Chippy slightly ahead of us. As we reached the top of the large rock, we could see slightly into the valley below on the other side, and what awaited us was an ocean of pristine wilderness. Hesitant at first, we slid down the steep and rocky slope and entered those woods as well. We followed both dogs deeper into the lush green darkness, and the further we went, Bean's barking grew more intense. We were getting close now. And then we heard the cries, followed by a sound that still gives me nightmares to this day. It was a sound an animal makes while being ripped apart by its predator, and it was definitely Bean making those cries. We stopped dead in our tracks, then it grew quiet. Both Sammy and Chippy were now at our sides, ears curled back and butts on the ground. They were afraid, and so were we. This was the first time we'd ever seen the dogs act like this during a hunting trip, and it was very out of character for them. We inched our way deeper into the trees until the darkness overtook us. But even in the fleeting light of day, we could still see the scene that was about to unfold. Without warning, the dogs began to growl, and instead of giving chase, they remained next to Jacob and I. And then we saw it. Movement about 15 to 20 yards away caught our attention, and it didn't take long for me to realize that it was Bean's limp and bloodied body slowly being jerked up into a tree. My first thought was a wildcat must have got to him. But we didn't see a cat. Strangest of all, we couldn't see what was doing it. All we could see was the tree and Bean's body slowly being lifted up into it, and then disappearing altogether. We gathered at the base of that dug fir and peered up for a better look, and hopefully a clear shot at whatever just killed my dog. The tree must have been 100 feet tall, and by now, Bean was so far up there that he was no longer visible. The shifting and dragging sound stopped as well, and everything grew quiet again. A little too quiet. We did a 360 walk around of the tree, but still, no sign of Bean. Where on earth could he have been? It was as if whatever had taken him just kept climbing up and never came down. We both popped off a few more rounds up into that tree to try and get some kind of reaction out of this thing. But again we were met with silence. We were completely devastated. Jacob and I remained there for another hour, using our nightlights to search every conceivable spot or crevice that Bean may have disappeared into. It was then we began to accept the reality of the situation. Bean was gone, and whatever had taken him may be back for us. So we got the hell out of there, and made our way back to civilization. I have never felt so guilty in my life as I did that night, and to this day, we leave the dogs at home during our hunting trips. I am still in disbelief from my experience, and as for Jacob, he's handling it better than me, but is still pretty shaken up about it. Looking back, there was something really creepy about that deer that we'd seen. The sheer size of it, the way it just stood there staring at us despite being shot at. It got me thinking, what if it wasn't a deer after all, but something more sinister disguised as one? Was it responsible for Bean's death and disappearance? I really believe it was. Thanks for letting me share my story. And there you have it. Just a few more strange wilderness stories to think about next time you find yourselves itching to go outdoors. Thanks for listening, and you'll hear from us soon. Good night.